Welcome to BICOM's weekly podcast. This is episode 51. I'm BICOM CEO James Sorene. I'm delighted to have with us this afternoon the security analyst Amos Harel from Ha'aretz. Amos, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, James.
So you're really the man to talk to about this, and I want to get a sense of what is going on vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinian Authority. This is obviously a strange period. The Israeli government coalition has not yet been formed, but the Prime Minister is obviously the same. The security establishment is the same. What is your sense of what is going on? Are we heading here towards a major moment of a breakdown in Israeli-Palestinian Authority relations, or is this going to be something that's just going to be resolved in the next few weeks? And if you can tell us a bit about the issues that constitute this sort of feud at the moment.
I think the realistic answer would be neither. I think that we're not exactly going into a direct confrontation. And you remember Yitzhak Rabin's old saying during the Oslo process that there are no sacred dates in the Middle East. On the other hand, I don't think that things are going to resolve anytime soon because of the new Israeli government's expected positions and also because of the Trump administration's policy. Going back to your question regarding the period or the timeline, the dates, what we've heard recently from the Trump administration is that the whole idea of the so-called deal of the century is going to be postponed and the presentation would be around beginning or mid-June. This is because they've decided to wait for the end of the month of Ramadan, which is supposed to start in about a week.
Right.
But we've seen so many delays in the past that I don't think that this is a concrete deadline, and therefore things can get postponed and delayed again and again, and I'm not even sure that we'll ever see a plan presented. Having said that, there's a serious crisis going on, and there are two main reasons for that. One is the Palestinian attitude towards this so-called deal of the century, and the other is the grave financial crisis in both the West Bank and Gaza. Very briefly, what the Palestinians are saying about the Trump administration is that it stopped being an honest broker, that they cannot trust them, and that they're very, very sure that there's a sort of a hidden conspiracy between Netanyahu and Trump regarding the American approach or the American initiative for peace. Therefore, they're very suspicious towards our motives and towards American motives as well. And there is, if it's ever presented, there's going to be a major crisis over that. Netanyahu, it's rather clear, is going to say yes, but Abbas is going to say no. And from then on, we could be approaching a crisis. The more urgent matter has to do with the financial affairs of the Palestinian Authority and also by proxy what's going on with Hamas in Gaza. As you know, Israel has made a decision to cut some of the payments, the tax returns actually, to the Palestinian Authority because of the disagreement over the fact that the PA is supporting financially prisoners, which Israel sees as terrorists who are held in our jails. And of course, Abbas, in response, decided that he's not going to accept any kind of money from Israel. This means a major financial crisis for the PA. And by now, there are about 165,000 government workers in the West Bank. That's about, I think, 1 out of 4 or 5 families in the West Bank. So people rely on this money from the state. And 50 to 60% of what they're earning, their salaries have been cut to half because of Abbas's decision and because of the crisis with Israel. This means immediate financial implications for almost every family in the West Bank. And later on, it affects Gaza as well, because as you know, Abbas has already decided to cut some of his financial help to Gaza, and Hamas is in an even tighter spot right now regarding this.
What percentage of that funding was? It was about 6 to 8%, wasn't it, of the funding that actually was the funding that Israel deducted? So just so people understand that they're kind of offered 100% a big pot of tax revenue, and they decided that because Israel deducted 6 to 8%, because they said that went to Palestinian prisoners and their families, they made a decision to receive zero. So they couldn't receive the other 80 8%, but they said no, we will receive nothing. So that's a huge decision.
Yeah, and one could say this is a spectacular own goal scored by Abbas, but this is his decision. There's something very symbolic about this. But this, again, has to do with the Palestinian national ethos and so on. The same people that we as Israelis see as terrorists, as murderers, they are the national heroes for Palestinians. And I think from his own domestic interest, he couldn't have survived any kind of agreement with Israel over that. Netanyahu understands that as well. And as you know, there was a gap that took more than a year between the original rule by the Knesset and Netanyahu's cabinet's decision to implement it 2 months ago, just before the elections. And this had to do with political reasons. Netanyahu was perfectly aware of the possible consequences. On the other hand, he was fighting for his political life at that time. He felt that he may lose votes to either Bennett or Lieberman. But he cannot be seen as somebody who has made any kind of a compromise or a concession. So they're looking for all kinds of ways of bypasses for this crisis. There has been a suggestion by the European Union that perhaps Europe would support those prisoners in Israeli jails. This is becoming complicated, but it's also dangerous, again, because of the implications on everyday life. And perhaps more than that, the people who are getting some of these salaries, or more to the point, not getting all the money that they have earned, some of them are the people who are in charge of the security situation in the West Bank. These are those who are security agencies who cooperate with Israel on a daily basis. And this is it's sort of a slippery slope. If something goes wrong in the near future, if there are more incidents and so on, I'm not sure that Israel could rely on these forces, on their support or their coordination as it did in the past, because of the frustration among the rank and file and also among the commanders. People are not getting their salaries. It's bound to affect the situation on the ground in the end.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was a European compromise proposal to sort of somehow integrate these prisoners into the welfare system, but I think the Palestinians rejected that. I mean, what's the solution there? I mean, someone's got to climb down. They've got to find a way to resolve it.
There's no solution yet. If we look at the way Netanyahu has handled himself recently regarding all Palestinian matters, you could see how cautious he actually was and how different his policies actually are than his image abroad. If you look at Gaza, there were all these pressures from the Israeli right, and even from some among Labor and Gantz's party and so on, for him to act more aggressively in Gaza. He did not do that. He prevented war in Gaza over the last year. There was a serious crisis on the Temple Mount, which he again decided to solve. The only matter where he took a different step had to do with the prisoners, and he's in trouble there because he doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver, and because he doesn't want to be seen as somebody who made too much of a deep concession to the other side.
What's the view of the Israeli, I suppose, military establishment and the people that are dealing with the, I suppose, security cooperation with the Palestinian Authority? I mean, do you think that they are urging some kind of deal to be reached because it will start to affect, the way the Palestinian security forces operate, start to affect sort of tensions in the West Bank? What are they saying?
I think I know by now. It's not that I think or that I have any kind of a theory about that. It's very, very clear that most of the people in the Israeli security apparatus are against these cuts to the PA's finances, and that they're very troubled by the possibility that this may go on for a while and that this would affect the West Bank's economy, and more to the point that this would also damage the security coordination between Israel and the PA. This is getting to be serious. It's getting to be a matter. I know that Netanyahu himself is concerned, but as I said, he sort of stuck himself into a corner, and it's quite difficult to get out of this. And of course, Abu Mazen Abbas is not making it any easier himself because of his own principles and because of his own domestic calculations and so on. And of course, Hamas is taking advantage of the situation as well. But as I said, if we look at Netanyahu during the last year or so, he's been quite pragmatic on most of these issues. I forgot to mention the prisoners' hunger strike, the Palestinian prisoners. It was solved within days. And again, Netanyahu actually, for the first time, allowed the installment of public payphones in those jail cells. This is, again, something that the hard right would never have thought acceptable a few weeks ago, and yet the prime minister did that. If I'm trying to think of a positive scenario of solving this, one might say that the fact that he did win by quite a significant margin during the elections, and that he's going through to build a new coalition, and that he seems bigger than life, so to speak, when you talk of politics right now, leaves him more room to maneuver than before. And, he's been through such problems in the past and managed to solve them without getting into, a direct military conflict. And one of the things that is important to note about Netanyahu is the fact that he's actually quite weary, quite risk-averse, and quite weary of the possibility of war, whether it's with the Palestinians or in Lebanon. He hasn't been gung-ho about these issues before. He's actually very well aware of the law of unintended consequences once a war begins, and he's trying to prevent war as much as he can, and that's rather different than his image abroad.
Yeah. So on a similar theme, moving on to Gaza, it would appear to be the case that we have a bizarre scenario where there have been understandings reached between Israel and Gaza. The situation on the border in terms of weekly demonstrations has calmed right down at the behest of Hamas. But yet we have Palestinian Islamic Jihad who seem to be trying to disrupt those understandings and trying to create tension with firing missiles and other things. And a situation this week where the IDF kind of identified specifically that Palestinian Islamic Jihad was responsible. So how do you read that situation and what will happen in the future?
There are two issues here at work. One is, as you mentioned, the Islamic Jihad. I think that Iran is probably behind some of this action. Every now and then, either the Iranians or Islamic Jihad or some other organization in Gaza is sending a sort of a sign from Gaza by launching one rocket or two rockets or something like that may endanger the quite volatile situation. And on top of that, you have Hamas's problems as well, because there is a sort of an agreement, but there's no final agreement or final ceasefire, long-term ceasefire between the two sides. There have been discussions over this for ever since ever. I mean, for the last year or so, there have been so many negotiations with the Egyptians, but no final agreement has been reached. There were many expectations on the Palestinian side in Gaza that after the elections, if they keep their promise of not breaking into a military escalation, which is something that was extremely important to Netanyahu before the elections, then they would get something in return immediately after that. But no final agreement has been reached yet. And on top of this, there's a problem at this moment regarding financial help from Qatar. And we're just a few days before Ramadan. So Hamas is quite anxious as well. As far as I can tell from speaking from both to people on the Palestinian side and many on the Israeli side, it seems as if Hamas is not secretly behind this. This is Iran and Islamic Jihad's work, and Hamas is actually quite desperate to reach an agreement soon, or at least some understanding regarding the transfer of finances from Qatar before Ramadan. But still, as I said, it's a dangerous situation right now, and it's always decided on the ground. If there's suddenly an escalation, suddenly some violent demonstrations tomorrow, and many people die there, and we've seen that happen many times during the last year or so, we can have another escalation. It's a very quick road to more rockets, more Israeli strikes, and so on.
Yeah.
Although, as you mentioned, when you compare the situation right now to where we were a month or 2 months ago, it's rather clear that things are more in control by Hamas and that they're trying to restrain violence from their side. This cannot go on forever. Israel would need to deliver something, whether it's to begin with more Qatari money immediately, and later on some kind of a system of understandings which allows Hamas more room to maneuver financially in Gaza, more freedom of movement for people to get out of the Gaza Strip. And this perhaps would help them both improve the infrastructure and prevent any kind of military escalation soon.
So my final question, really, I mean, we're in 12 days' time, it's going to be the anniversary of probably one of the deadliest days on the Israel-Gaza border for at least kind of 4 or 5 years, where there were major demonstrations on the Gaza border fence and a very large number of Palestinians were shot by IDF fire. Do you think that there will be a move to commemorate those events that could potentially lead to another sort of round of violent escalation, or do you think Hamas is going to work very hard to try and keep that under control? What's your sense?
As of this moment, I haven't heard anything regarding mid-May. And as you said, those were very violent demonstrations for 2 days, and 60 Palestinians died. That was the day the American embassy moved to Jerusalem. And this was demonstrations that had to do with that, both protest against that and the situation in the Gaza Strip, the siege around the Gaza Strip, and so on. Currently, this is not the mood in Gaza. I think Hamas is searching for a solution, but we are entering a rather uneasy period because we have Israeli Memorial Day. Immediately after that, we have Israeli Independence Day. And on top of that, a week later, we have the Eurovision contest in Tel Aviv. And we've already heard some threats from Islamic Jihad and so on, saying that they would try to interfere with the celebrations in Tel Aviv. So things are going to get, if not nasty, then at least more tense during the next few weeks. But at one point or another, some kind of a long-term ceasefire in Gaza, because if not, the first security challenge his government would be facing would be escalation in Gaza, military escalation. And as I said, he was doing everything in his power to prevent that quite successfully during the last year, in spite of those massive demonstrations, in spite of all that violence and the fact that hundreds of Palestinians died during those violent incidents. He did prevent another war, another military operation. The last time he decided to approve a military operation was the summer of 2014. It's very evident that he's not interested in any kind of a repeat of that case. And he will have to move forward. He would have to take some action and maybe take some risks in order to organize some kind of a long-term solution with Hamas. Again, this is not because Hamas is turning Zionist or because it would be willing to recognize Israel or anything like that. But the fact, perhaps it's even easier for Netanyahu because he doesn't have to give them a lot. There are no negotiations in the future. There's no discussion of, land swaps or anything like that. It's all about coexistence with less fighting. And this is something he can afford politically. He still has to go through the actual agreement, and that's evidently this is quite complicated.
So ironically, in conclusion, it's sort of Gaza and Hamas more straightforward at the moment, but the PA a whole different ballgame and actually much more complicated.
Exactly.
It's an interesting conclusion. Amos Harel, thank you so much for joining us. That was brilliant.
Thank you, James.